In fact,
Okay, press the
Apollo
record button.
13 has not landed yet, splashed down yet 53 years ago. But I talked to Jim. He's in Chicago with his wife. So she's both still living. Jim is 95 years old now and doing well otherwise. But we're all getting aged. The book I wrote, I had the first chapter of growing up just tells a story of I'll call it the world's conditions. I hope to get an impression of the world's conditions back then, which was quite different today, both in small town of Biloxi, Mississippi, where I grew up, and in Chicago. I talked to the school days, and particularly elementary school. In both cases, both Chicago and where I was in Biloxi, we pretty much were allowed to roam around free. I could every day had to either run around. I didn't have a bicycle till I was actually in high school, but I could go around the city, use the school playground, had no fences. Never teachers were on the playground, and you could go before school and stay till dusk after school and play. And that was the rule. I had to be home by dusk. There was no school busing. There's no fence around the schoolyard, but I could roam around the town freely. And same way in Chicago, I'd be out till that school, the Belmont School, not too far from downtown Chicago, was same way, completely open, free to use the school ground. Of course, my mother didn't like it because that school they had no grass. It only had concrete and cinders. So I ended up getting dirty every day. But it was mainly to give a little feeling of life back then. This is now in the late 30s. That it is quite different than today, and maybe extremely so in Chicago. I'm not sure if I went back to that area, if I'd be roaming around the dusk on my own today. But at any rate, I then went into more how I got into the sort of first path to the astronaut office. When by the Korean War, I got interested in serving my country, and at the age I was, with 2 years of college, it sort of forced me into joining a program called the Naval Aviation Program, which my dad had always encouraged me if I went into something to try to get something that led to a commission as a commission officer. He'd been in the Merchant Marine 12 years and in the Navy during World War II. And so anyway, I signed up for the Naval Aviation Cadet Program, which was the only one available that led with 2 years of college to a commission. And I had never been in an airplane before, not even sitting on the ground. So it was kind of a quite a dramatic change in where I was headed, because I thought in high school and 2 years of junior college, my thoughts were to become a journalist. And I had worked in that capacity on a high school newspaper and junior college newspaper, and even for the local daily paper during summers with the spot jobs that the city editor would give me to do. So anyway, I love flying, and that was the real big change. Almost instantly from first flight, I knew this was going to be something I wanted to do. At least wasn't quite sure what it was, but I was going to stay close to aviation. Because obviously I'm talking about 1952, 54, when I was through flight training. There was no space program yet, but I wanted to stay close to flying airplanes somehow. So I went through my career then after flight training into 2 Marine fighter squadrons. And through that journey, I got the feeling and interest in, what's next. And talking to people, decided I would try to become a test pilot. And I knew that required some more education. Test pilots normally have engineering degrees, because unlike Hollywood movies, they don't just call you up the day the airplane's ready to fly. You're normally a part of the program, the development program, and catering to the human factors and the aircraft design to get it ready. Or in the case of where I ended up with NASA, you're part of the test team to devise the program you're going to run. And I got interested in, at that time, it was NACA. It did not become NASA. And I was talking to my squadron commander in the Air National Guard in Oklahoma while going to the University of Oklahoma. He convinced me I should go to work for NACA because I would get more experience in many different aircraft on different test programs. Whereas with a company, you would normally be assigned to a new development of an aircraft and might spend 4 or 5 years through that development phase before you even got to fly the aircraft. So I did. I searched around and found an opening at Lewis Research Center in Cleveland, Ohio, which is now named Glenn after John Glenn, for $5,460 a year. So that was my starting salary, and that was in 1959. So, obviously being a test pilot wouldn't make you a millionaire, but I would be having a lot of fun in different test programs flying aircraft. One of the programs worth mentioning at Lewis was a zero-G program. This was before NASA got into it down at Johnson, Manned Spacecraft Center in Johnson. The first zero-G program was run by the Air Force, first at White Sands, and then they moved it to Wright-Patterson in Ohio. They were testing human subjects. We got an AJ-2 surplus aircraft from the Navy, which had a large bomb bay. And we floated experiments around, mainly related to fluid systems. One cooling cycle we ran for the SNAP-8 nuclear power generator. That was flown on some satellites. We flew a program with hydrogen, actually, to develop the screen configuration for the Centaur rocket. That's still being flown today, in fact, an upper stage booster. And so we were more involved in that kind of testing, not the human side, although I got a lot of zero-G time because we alternated pilots during each of these missions, which got tiring flying that trajectory to get the 20-25 seconds of zero-G. So we'd trade off in the flight, and one pilot would end up in the payload bay, mainly handling the positioning of the experiments for the next run. So you spend a lot of time floating around in the payload bay doing some of these experiments. And I later moved on, kind of following the path of Neil Armstrong. Neil had started at Lewis for NACA at the time. He joined Lewis Research Center. And Neil had moved on to Edwards Air Force Base, got to fly the X-15, which I never did. But I followed Neil about 3 years behind him and moved on to Edwards, which was kind of the biggest aircraft test operations NASA had at the time. At Flight Research Center, now incidentally named Armstrong after Neil. And flew a number of test programs there, a lot of support flights, various types supporting the X-15 program, which was still going on. But by that time, the space program had come along, and with the original 7, and even then into Gemini. And I frankly was not that interested in leaving all the fun I was having flying aircraft of different types. In fact, on my website, www.fredhaise.space, who cares to look at it, you'll see more narrative and a lot of pictures and some archival data from across my lifespan in those days that you wouldn't find in the book. And but I found very interesting one month on 2 pages to cover my flying at Edwards. It's in the website. I flew 9 different types of aircraft and involved in 3 different test programs. So one of the things I had in the book was I was now realizing the way we progressed in our NASA office, pilot's office, was if you were going to get the fly the X-15, it was going to be by your seniority in the office. And there were 2 people still ahead of me, actually 3. But Bruce Peterson had crashed one of the lifting bodies and lost an eye. That was a scene from the $6 Million Man TV program where the vehicle crashed. Bruce was flying that vehicle that day. And so that took him out of the, he was ahead of me, but it took him out of the way. But there were still 2 people waiting to maybe fly the X-15. And I began to realize that probably the program would be over before I'd get my chance. And Neil visited back at Flight Research Center after he had flown Gemini 8 in that program. And talking to Neil, Don Malik and I cornered him and asked, what's it like being an astronaut? And Neil's answer was, well, you sit in a lot of meetings, you sit in a simulator a lot, and there's not much good flying. So, and he was comparing it with his experience back at Flight Research Center. So I had to think hard about it, but I realized without the X-15 ahead, the only way I was going to get to fly higher and faster was to join the astronaut program. So I applied and was accepted in 1966. So one segment of the book and the website covers those days as a research pilot. I then moved on to the astronaut office, and within the website, you'll track my salary increases with some of the NASA actually official paperwork, and still wasn't getting very rich. Even moving to Johnson Space Center at the time named Manned Spacecraft Center, and was lucky enough to get in the lineup. It was 19 of us chosen in that 1966 group, and I was assigned to the first mission that any of our group got assigned to on Apollo 8, and I served as the backup lunar module pilot along with Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong. We were the crew. We were the backup crew for Apollo 8. In the normal mission cycle, which was normally 3 missions, you would think I would have got to fly Apollo 11, but unfortunately, Mike Collins, who had been taken off the prime crew for 8 because of a medical problem, got well. And Deke, because he had had the previous prime assignment, Deke Slayton, reinserted Mike into the crew, and he was also a group ahead of me in the selection, and to the Apollo 11 crew. So Mike, Buzz, and Neil flew Apollo 11, and I served another backup with Jim Lovell and Kim Mattingly. Of course, Apollo 13 has one chapter in the book. It's some people complained it was too short. In fact, the book too short as a whole, which is why I created the website. But so much had been written about Apollo 13. There have been a number of books. Jim Lovell wrote a book. Gene Kranz in his book, Failure is Not an Option, had a large write-up on Apollo 13, and Chris Kraft had written a book also covered 13, and there were documentaries, a number of documentaries. So I decided to kind of try to cater to things that might have not been covered in some of those books, and so that's why it would appear short in terms of the total book length. But anyway, I did tell a couple of things. One thing that was not covered in any other books, and because it's more thinking about it from a crewman standpoint, and not covered in media, even a movie, because it was not something you could show very well in media, was the getting close to entry. We had a dead mothership, the command module, had never been planned to be shut down in flight. And of course, as a result, there was no procedure to power it up in flight. And that had to be invented by a lot of hours spent by people on the ground creating that startup procedure, and a lot of other astronauts testing it in simulators to perfect it. A lot of redlining, I guess, went on and many iterations. But they didn't complete it when what they felt was the final version to pass up to Jack Schweiger to copy, incidentally, on backs of books, checklists that he had torn off because we had no blank paper. We had no blank paper on Apollo 13. So he used the backs of books to scribble that on, carefully numbering the pages. It was quite lengthy. And so we were given that 17 hours before entry. So this spacecraft is dead, and we got to power it up. And we first got to look at the procedure to even how to maybe power it up 17 hours before we're going to hit the air at 25,000 miles an hour. They did not clear us, and Jack Ensign and I, who were going to do that power up, we talked through it to kind of give ourselves the flow of the activation checklist. And we weren't allowed, though, to go into the command module and start the power up till 2.5 hours before we were going to hit the air. So we crawled into this damp, wet spacecraft, dark, with flashlights to read. And the first thing we noticed was the instrument panel was covered with water, all the instruments. So Jack Swigert broke out 2 towels, and we wiped off all the instruments so we could see them. And then we're getting ready to start into activation. And the first steps were to push in a bunch of circuit breakers that were on panels on each side of the command module. And Jack stopped and he said, looking at all that water, he was thinking of the Apollo 1 fire and the electric short. And he said, I tell you what, he said, let's just push in 6 breakers at a time. I'll call it, and we'll stop. And we'll wait a little bit, a minute maybe, and see if we smell any insulation burning on the wiring. So that's the way we went through that initial part of that activation, was getting the circuit breakers in, and we got through it all, and no fire started. And I have to give credit to the accident investigation from the Apollo 1 fire that killed the crew on the launch pad, because one of the things that were not recommended but dictated from that accident investigation, not only was the massive structural changes for the command module with the new hatch to allow you to get out quicker, but also to redo the whole protocol on spacecraft wiring. And that was imposed not just on the command module, but also on all the lunar modules. And by doing so, with the things they imposed, including hermetically sealing at all the connector interfaces for wiring, we basically had a waterproof wire harness. And that saved us at that time from, again, suffering probably an electric short that might have occurred as we went through that power up, which obviously worked well. And we jettisoned the lunar module. Jim stayed in to have common communication, and then cleared out, and we closed the hatches. And we separated that limb 45 minutes from hitting the air. We're cocked off at a yaw angle aside to kick it free from overpressurizing in the tunnel between the 2 vehicles, to give it a little kick to get clear so it wouldn't hit us during entry. And got through that to a safe splashdown. But at any rate, I went on from the astronaut program to join Grumman Corporation in New York, first and running space programs in New York. And after about 3 years, I went off to bid a major contract that would put Grumman into the service business, which primarily we're interested in because George Skurla, who at that time headed Grumman Aerospace, he had led the Grumman team at Kennedy Space Center that had done all the testing and preparing of the lunar modules for launch. And he was interested in seeing Grumman back in Florida. So, because that Grumman had not been in the service business up to that time. And that's where basically you bid Grumman contracts, government contracts, and you're supplying labor that's going to do the job as specified in the request for proposals. But anyway, we won that contract. That was the first major contract under a new subsidiary company was formed to be in that business. And I was teamed with Lockheed and Thiokol, and had a total of about initially 950 people at Kennedy, and about planned to be about 350 at Vandenberg when shuttles were thought to be eventually launched from there. And I had that contract for 12 years. And so that's another major part of the book in a chapter. And I did lead an internal investigation after the initial shuttle accident, the Challenger, really looking at every piece of documentation and interviewing over 100 people that were working through that flow, preparing that vehicle for launch to make sure we had not done anything wrong in our processing of the hardware before that accident. As it turned out, as we all, those that are familiar with it, it was caused by embrittlement in O-rings and the solid rocket booster with extreme cold weather that week, even leading up to the launch, that caused leakage and the explosion that happened on Challenger. But another major part of the book, a chapter, is my 4 years I spent leading a contract for the system engineering and integration of the space station that was called Freedom at that time, and where I actually moved to Washington to head that contract. And at the end of that chapter, I label that my time in purgatory, not because of the job we did and had to do several iterations of the space station, so what we call restructuring, because of the funding shortfall. It was a real tough job. I spent a lot of time with our lobbyists on the Hill with staffers and congressmen trying to save the program during that 4 years. In fact, 1 year, if Congress had they shifted one vote, there would have not be a space station today. And that space station, Freedom, incidentally, obviously morphed into the ISS. After the Russians joined the program, they changed the name to the International Space Station, which is still up there today, and it's had people on board since 2000. Constantly from 2000, there have been humans in orbit on board the space station. And I worked that project 4 years. I then left that program and went back to running the company that had started, and went back to a number of years in winning contracts, both with NASA and primarily, I'd say, bigger contracts with the military during my ensuing total of 17 years with Northrop Grumman. After I retired, I was 6 years on the Astronaut Memorial Foundation board, which created the Space Mirror at Kennedy Space Center. If those have been there, that immortalizes the names of astronauts who have died in the line of duty at that visitor center at Kennedy, and also went into a education program more for the teachers who are IT, computer-oriented teachers at schools throughout the state of Florida. The next thing I got into after retirement from Grumman was to join a board, and actually I've been involved 15 years now, and was there from day one, where our initial not-for-profit board formed, had the chore of raising $40 million to build and develop Infinity Science Center in Mississippi, which is at the same exit as Stennis Space Center is, where it tests rockets. Although we're south, that exit, you go south versus north to Stennis, adjacent to the state Welcome Center. And we finally got the money and enough to get the construction underway for the facility and open up in 2005. And of course, like all museums and not-for-profits, we suffered during the COVID years, 2019 through 2020, but are up and operating and financially solvent with just operating to cover our operating costs from attendance, gift shop, small cafe. So we're doing okay again following that down episode. In fact, we shut down for over 6 months during that period. It just attendance went to nothing during COVID. But at any rate, that's been my life. I've attended a lot of events over the years, many with museums and more fundraisers to help, and have cut down travel quite a bit because I developed neuropathy. which has now put me to, if I go out and about or in the large crowds, I use a three-wheel walker, which has really hurt any face-to-face attendance at elementary schools. It's hardly to go in and talk to a class of elementary students with my gray hair, glasses, and using the three-wheel walker. They really, I can't convince them I was ever an astronaut. Looking like that. So at any rate, I do Zoom calls as we're doing today of all sorts, including some at schools, and do events at Space Center Houston. I live in Houston, and Space Center Houston is nearby. I've done a number of talks there with student groups in the summer. They host, and teachers, teacher groups that come in that are math and science teachers, where I personally can get there easily and attend those events. So anyway, that's kind of my life story up to this point. As I said, where I'm reaching 90 in November, and just feel really blessed and privileged to have had the career and I've had. So maybe now we open it up for questions.
We certainly will. Thank you very much, Fred, for sharing your life story there. And we have a microphone that we're going to take around the audience here, and I know we have some people eager to ask you questions, but I'm going to start with the first question because you kind of glossed over one part of your career, and I thought maybe you can relate a never panic early moment with that, and that's your involvement with the approach and the ALT, the approach and landing.
Right. Yeah, actually,
so can you tell us what your biggest concern with that whole project was?
Okay. Yeah, I actually left the astronaut office to join the Orbiter Project Office, working for a fellow named Aaron Cohen, who later became director of Johnson Space Center. And at the time, he was the project manager for the Orbiter. And so I was there and more in the management, oversight, check and balance, financially even for the program during 4 years through the Orbiter from day one when we selected even the contractor Rockwell, who would build the Orbiter. And so it's kind of a womb to tomb experience because I was so heavy involved in the initial design and development. I'll say Apollo uniquely is the only program NASA's had heretofore that was funded fully per the program plan, that had full support from administration and Congress to make it happen. It's been a struggle in every program since. Shuttle to boot. We took some risk in trying to deal with the funding shortfall, and to try to hold as best we could getting flying to a schedule as quick as we could. For instance, we gave up a lot of test articles. We at one time had both the crew cabin and the F section vibroacoustic articles. This is where you take the structure in a building at Johnson that had big horns in the wall that could acoustically bombard the structure to the same degree it would suffer at launch. And actually the impact of that was higher on the orbiter and shuttle than it was in Apollo, because if you recall, the Saturn V was a big tall rocket, and the command and service module and the LEM were way up on the top of that structure. So they were way away from the engines when they lit off for launch. Whereas the orbiter, external tanks, and were right adjacent to the solid rocket engines and the 3 engines on the space shuttle that lit off for launch. So the acoustic levels that structure had to suffer were higher. And we deleted the crew cabin. And that really bothered me at the time. I was worried about that aspect of one of the test articles we deleted. We kept the F section, which actually was closer to the engines and the higher vibration levels. We did no thermal vac test. In Apollo, we tested a full-scale lunar module and a full-scale command service module in chambers that could replicate vacuum of space and also represent the temperature and cooling the spacecraft would suffer in orbit and going back and forth to the moon. And the only thermal vacuum testing we did on the space shuttle was one payload bay door and one OMS pod. That carried a little engine that would get you through rendezvous and in and out of lunar orbit to re-enter. We worried about freezing. And so we did those tests of just those components of the space shuttle. So there's a lot of things done that way to save money. We actually used a test article, turned it into a flight vehicle, and that was OB-99, which became a Challenger. It was our structural test article, a full vehicle, full orbiter, and we limited the loads and the test operation we had actually at a Lockheed facility at Palmdale to 80% of flight loads, and extrapolated mathematically from there to feel comfortable that we had done that structural testing. And of course, we deleted all testing of the long range testing that we might have done on it. So shuttle never had any of that lifetime testing, and turned it into a flight hull that was made into a flight vehicle. So those kind of things were done, trying to take money out of the program to still try to hold schedule. For Enterprise, I flew in a test program, a landing test program at Edwards in 1977. We actually had a backup Enterprise. We had a second vehicle planned, and that got deleted very early for cost. So those are the kind of things you fight through in a program where you take money out. And it's an unfortunate thing that when you have a program plan, I don't think there's anybody in Congress that understands if you reduce the funding, you're forcing those kind of changes that actually will lengthen the program time and often result in overruns. And so I don't think anybody in Congress that has ever been in a development program has any understanding of what I call system engineering practice and planning and scheduling. So that happens often because of those changes made. But at any rate, in spite of that risk, we got Enterprise ready to fly in '77. I was assigned as one of two crews. I was the commander. Gordon Fullerton was the pilot with me. And the other crew was Joe Engel and Dick Truly. Dick later became administrator at NASA in his later career. And we were scheduled to fly an 8-test flight program, 3 of them captive, where we would not release off the top of the 747. And then we had 5 where we would cut it loose. 747 was used as our launch vehicle. That could get us up to about a little over 25,000 feet for most of these flights, to then separate and do test maneuvers on the way down to a landing. Of course, we were a glider, did not have engines. So they were fairly short flights. I think the longest one was a little over 5 minutes, 5 minutes and 20-something seconds. But we do maneuvers on the way down to stress the dynamics of the vehicle. And also, of course, did the landings. And in reverse, after landing, tested wheel brakes and nose wheel steering. It's kind of backwards from how you would do it in an aircraft test program, where you normally do taxi tests because you had engines down the runway and test your brakes and nose wheel steering before you ever took off the first time. But we had to do it backwards. And so we just did it by letting us slow down on the first flights each time to a velocity where we'd start that, gradually building up on later flights to call it normal landing speeds to test brakes and nose wheel steering. So it's an interesting program, and I really consider when I flew that first flight on Enterprise to be a highlight of my career, really, because I was so involved in the design that early on. I'd missed that in Apollo. I got in the program after that was completed to get to fly the first flight. It was a concern. Probably I felt a lot of pressure that day we were going to release it the first time, because we had changed presidents. With that January, we had changed to a new president from Nixon, President Nixon, who actually started the program, to Jimmy Carter. And of course, in any major program, you worry about how the support will come from the administration and of course Congress to continue the program. And secondly, NASA had the early tile problem. In fact, when they did a ferry flight the first time at Columbia, a lot of tile fell off as they were taking it to Kennedy, and had a lot of rework to do and figuring out how to best attach the tiles to the vehicle to prevent that, and announced a 2-year slip in the first orbital flight. So that was in my mind. And to that bad news as we got ready to fly Enterprise and worried about if something went wrong, and I actually damaged or crashed the vehicle. Reflected when we climbed aboard that morning, there was a photo beside the ladder as I climbed up to get up to the ejection seats, climb in. And the photo was of persons in blue suits like we were wearing, flight suits, wearing a helmet like we had, visor down, and oxygen mask sort of dangling, so you couldn't tell who these people were. They're sitting on a huge sweeper, the kind that sweeps city streets, running this sweeper. And the little note beside this said, "If you screw this up, this is your next job." So the workers were worried too about whether this flight be successful or not.
That's great. Thank you very much, Fred. I have a question for you from Hugh Neeson. He's a former Bell vice president, and I think I let you know in email that our museum is very near the Bell plant. There's a lot of things that went on in Western New York to support the Apollo program, shuttle program, and all programs since. But Hugh's going to ask you a question.
Hello.
Hello, sir. Yeah.
What I remember was, what day of the week did you land?
What? I'm sorry, what?
What day of the week? From Apollo 13.
I didn't understand the question again. What that?
What was the day of the week of your landing?
Oh, the date of our splashdown?
Yeah, you come down. Yes.
Yeah, that was 17th this month, 53 years ago. So the day's what, the 15th? In 2 days.
Was it a Saturday?
2 days from now is when we splashed down 53 years ago.
Yes. Do I remember? I think I was in the parking lot listening to the transmission. Did your reentry was a lot longer than the normal reentry, and the blackout a long time before the word came down, the parachutes are out?
Yeah, what actually I didn't quite get all the question, but I said the time you feel on any flight, any Apollo flight, as I assume Mercury and Gemini as well, the time when you know you really have it made is when you can look out the window and see those chutes. That's when you know you've got a successful ending to the mission. No, if the chutes didn't deploy on any one of those, you'd have lost the crew, because we depended on parachutes to get us a safe splashdown. Incidentally, one other thing, in the book, I had one chapter on my time spent 14 months at Grumman as an astronaut testing the early testing of the lunar modules. That I hoped and gave people a feeling of the schedule pressure throughout the program, and that was everywhere. It wasn't just at Grumman; it was at North American, who was developing the command and service module, and probably impacted more because they had that accident where they lost the crew on the launch pad and had significant redesign. But also at our subcontractors, meeting schedules with just constantly pressure during that whole program. A lot of hardship on families. Grumman, the workers, most of them were on 3-shift operation, 12. And that year, I was at Grumman, 67. Test operations went 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The only planned shutdown day that whole year was Christmas Day. So that was kind of the task, and that was everywhere through the program at North American and all the subcontractors trying to meet delivery schedules of their components to get the finished manufacturing and get the vehicles ready to ship to Kennedy. So it was a lot of pressure, almost like a war without shooting for the people involved at that time. It's just it was a very unique program. There's not been one like it since.
I have a question. I'm Norm Weingarten, and I worked at CalSpan, and it was right after the ALT flights. There was a flight control problem, and they used our total in-flight simulator, the TIFs, and you were one of the evaluation pilots. I was
Right.
project engineer from CalSpan, and we were investigating improvements and causes of that PIO, pilot-induced oscillation. Do you remember working with us at CalSpan?
Yes, I did. I actually worked earlier with CalSpan. I spent a good part of 5 or 6 weeks, and not a good time of the year at February in Buffalo, in a cold hangar where I forget the pilot's name, Meeker, I think it was a test pilot I worked with. Unfortunately, I think he later was lost, and he flew with the Niagara Air National Guard F-100s. And
Yeah, Meeker.
at any rate, I worked with him to develop cases that then when he flew the aircraft out to Edwards, and I flew the test cases we had developed then to be primary look-see and training for Milt Thompson and Bruce Peterson, who were slated to fly the first lifting body, the M2 F2 that was launched from a B-52. And you're right, on ALT, on the last landing flight, I got too intense in trying to hit the spot on the runway and oversaturated the pitch channel, and bounced a little bit, 1,000-foot long landing, and the wing had a roll in. And unfortunately, the way the system was devised at that time, when you were saturated in a channel, in this case pitch, I had no roll control, and I made a couple of inputs and no roll response. And the third input was too big, which put me into a jockeying back and forth, what's called a pilot-induced oscillation, until Gordon Fullerton coached me to just let go of the control and let things dampen out, which they did. And of course, we changed the software, I guess, in the system following that, so you could never completely get locked out of at least roll and pitch. You'd always have some authority, even if you got close to saturation in one or the other. And we did fly a program in a CalSpan aircraft, and not just myself and a number of the pilots who were posing to fly a space shuttle, to try to replicate that PIO, but I don't think it ever got done, because in a thing like a CalSpan aircraft or a simulator, you can't get your adrenaline flow and gains up to the same level that I was at on that occasion, and the actual vehicle landing. So I'm not sure, but we did do a number of changes, like I said, to affect software to reduce that possibility. I think a HUD, heads-up display, was also added to the shuttle to enhance the pilot's controllability during landing.
Yeah. Well, we did reproduce the PIO and worked on another project in 1979 to look at the improvements. But NASA wasn't the only company that had that problem. I worked on with Sweden with their Gripen, the JAS-39 Gripen. They had an identical problem on that. So.
Right.
Yeah, hi, Fred. I want to say this is a real honor, but my name is Walter Gordon. I'm retired aerospace engineer locally from Moog, and also affiliated with the museum. I was the president before Don. One of the things we're most proud of coming out of Bell in Western New York, right next door, is the LLRV and the LLTV. And this year we're actually honoring a Bell engineer who worked on that, Bill Bascom, to celebrate the accomplishments. But I was wondering if you could tell us about your experience with those vehicles and what you thought of them.
Yeah, the LLTV was a trainer that through the computer could set you up in a condition to negate air drag, kind of put you in a vacuum environment, so to speak, and could put you into a descent situation that you set up where you would be obligated to use some hydrogen peroxide downward firing rocket motors to arrest your descent and affect the control of the vehicle with little small thrusters on all the quadrants of this bedstead looking vehicle to control attitude to affect the lunar landing. It was a very difficult task. I say I would give it a pilot rating like 3 or 4 flying versus this and a Cooper Hopper pilot rating system. Number 1 was a perfect flight control system, ability to fly, handling qualities, and 10 was unflyable. So I'd rate the LLTV at about 3 or 4, which same as the LEM, although I unfortunately never got to fly it to a real landing. And I flew 22 flights. We had mishaps early on. Neil Armstrong was the most publicized. He ejected from one at low altitude. Joe Algrani, the chief NASA pilot at Ellington, headed the flight operations there of the maintenance of the T-38s and the LLTV operation. Flew it when it first had a crew cabin, I think, mounted on it to give you a window view out. So you now had the visual view as if you were in the LEM lunar module. And I think Joe got going too fast forward, and the drag on that crew cabin, the flat face of it, tended to pitch it up where he could not stop the pitch up, and ejected from that vehicle, and actually had the closest encounter. I think he got one swing of the chute with using the ejection seat before he hit the ground. The third one was kind of benign ejection. Stu Present was at, I think, about 400 or 500 feet on a flight with the LLTV, and lost all electrical. And I think he tried to switch. There was a way of switching to alternate, and it didn't work. And so he ejected pretty much straight and level, I think, at that altitude. So it was call it a fairly benign or safe ejection. But we lost 3 of those vehicles. There was a push by NASA management to discontinue that training. Neil, after his accident, particularly after his accident, he strongly stressed that if you're going to send people to the moon and land, you need to put them in that high stress environment with those similar landing characteristics to be able to handle, to effectively have a safe landing, and it's worth the risk. And that's why they continued the program in spite of those accidents we had.
Okay, and thank you for mentioning the Cooper Harper scale, because Bob Harper, of course, is from Cal Spen and a friend of some of us in this room.
Right, and Cooper was a test pilot, research pilot at NASA Ames Research Center. I met both gentlemen along the way.
Let me ask the audience, does anyone have a question for Fred? I have a few. Wait, I see a question back here. We're going to bring the mic back. And Fred, do you have a few more moments for us?
Sure, yep,
Wonderful.
no problem.
Hello, this is Barry Nobles from the Backyard Lander, which is a half-size lunar lander that we travel around Western New York with. My question is, when you left the LEM for the last time on the Apollo 13, is there anything you wanted to bring with you?
Yes, we really had a page in our checklist as we left the LEM that we would have used had it been normal circumstances, which was things we were going to remove and bring home. Unfortunately, we were using the LEM to the last moments, so to speak, as that flight turned out. So we're quite limited in what we could do because it was active, as I said, right to the last hours. So I went in and I beat off, I could do that. There was a little thing you could raise, and I beat off the armrest for the hand controllers, 4 of them. They could be removed. I actually had tools that we carried. We had tools and planned to remove the hand controllers and bring them home. But that wasn't possible because they were being used. and removed, just had to turn the switch off and undo one connector, floodlights. There were two of them in the overhead with their cables, nice gold looking cables. Those were removed. I removed all the inner wall material. The lunar module, due to weight constraints, had no inner wall, unlike the command module, which was built like a battleship because it had to survive launch and entry loads. We only had netting material that had been put up with snaps to cover where the wiring bundles and plumbing lines ran. You could look through the netting and see those in a limb. There was no inner wall. That also meant you had no insulation and no noise suppression. So the limb comparatively was a pretty noisy vehicle. You could hear the pumps running loudly and cabin fans. In fact, that made Jack Swigert nervous. Kind of an interesting facet. We changed out a crewman 2.5 days before launch. Jack Swigert, due to the measles threat, to replace Ken Mattingly 2.5 days before we lifted off. Jack had never been in a lunar module in his life till in flight. He was the command module expert. He had spent all his time testing command modules out at the North American plant in California. And so he was a real expert on the command module. When he showed up in the limb after he shut it down, Jim Lovell and I left him to power up the lunar module. We left him alone to get the command module powered down after the explosion. He showed up in the limb and I guess he noticed the situation and the netting on the walls and the noise level. And actually the glycol pump in the limb, for whatever reason, occasionally made a gurgling sound, and it changed frequency, sort of whining. His first words was, "Do you think this vehicle will make it?" It was so different from the command module to him. But at any rate, it did, obviously. For 4 days, it did very well.
I was wondering, what are your thoughts on the commercialization of space flight?
Your voice a little shouts. Talk up a little louder, please, ma'am.
How do you feel about the commercialization of space flight?
I think it's great. It saved NASA, really. You know, we abandoned shuttle at a point, shut down that program. And our only way of getting up and down was with the Russian Soyuz to take supplies to the space station and people up and down. Actually, that's bad in itself. You always want, I think, on launch vehicles and that kind of capability spacecraft, it's always nice to have two ways to get up and down, particularly something you're trying to sustain, like the space station, because you never know, you may have an accident in one or the other, and that will likely shut you down for a year or more. So that was a happenstance when SpaceX came along, and could initially did a lot of flights, and they're amazing how many flights they've flown, and their reuse of the particularly the first stage. I think one had flown 6 times, the same one, refurbished and just put more, maybe change the engines and put more fuel in it to make it cheaper. That saved us in that sense. We now had a second vehicle that could carry a cargo up and bring the waste material and some experiments back down to Earth, and has also carried people. And they've actually flown one mission with people. I think there was not an astronaut aboard. I think it was one fellow of the group, I think, had flown aircraft, but was not an astronaut. And so it's been remarkable. Of course, the others, Blue Horizon and the Spaceship 1 and 2 program were good, although the third I mentioned, the latter, has kind of not done as well as far as the number of flights and getting people up, where they air launch it in a vehicle and it takes people up to 65, 60 sort of miles, that range. And Blue Horizon, though, has had more flights with more people aboard to experience the view from that sort of altitude, 65 miles or more, and quite a longer time in zero gravity, floating around to have that experience. So the more people experience that, the more the wonders of that view they see. I think is at least enhancing, and some of these obviously are paying customers, so are likely to be influential along the way. That can help future space program, getting programs started and funded.
Thank you very much, Fred. I know I have one more question for you, but does anyone else want to ask Fred a question? It's going to be a few minutes before we have to let him go here. So we're going to take the microphone back.
Hello, I'm Julie Stationero. Just wondering what your favorite craft to fly was.
My favorite aircraft to fly? Yeah, aircraft, you have to think of them as families of aircraft, be they attacked or fighters, or call it larger aircraft, be it transports or bombers. There actually are mil specs, different specifications that give the criteria for things like stick forces or rudder and pedal forces a pilot has. And also, of course, the aircraft are designed for different performance. A fighter, you want pretty spiffy sports car, high speed, high maneuverability, etc., high roll rate capability. And of course, the transport, you don't want to shake up the passengers on an airliner, so it doesn't require need the same and doesn't have the same handling characteristics, and on purpose in their design. So you have to look at it as a kind of the class. Fighters, the best, I'll call it natural, best flying machine handling qualities wise was the F-86 Saberjet. Now I have to paraphrase that with the thought that this was in the aircraft before we got into significant augmentation and software involved, and what the aircraft characteristics would do. But just from the natural airframe and the blending of the control, which had some hydraulic boost on some of the controls, it was just from the day I jumped into it, it just felt at home in almost all respects. When you describe handling qualities, it's hard to describe, but it's how the aircraft will, what it'll do with ease of what you're wanting to command it and have it do, be it fly at a certain altitude, steady, or what its trimability is, how well it can track a target in the case of a fighter, if you're doing air gunnery or fixing to drop a bomb, how well it can in the dive get the target centered properly, and that kind of thing. So that was of the transports, and I had not flown many of the heavies. I've flown the 747, 707, Canberra's British bomber, flown the AJ2 I mentioned, and the program, 0G program we had. But I guess the most best from the standpoint of its reliability, handling qualities probably not, was the old DC-3. When I joined NASA, that was the primary transport that the centers had. We had actually an R4D, a Navy version at Lewis, because our boss, Eb Goff, was a Navy Reserve captain, and so he wanted a Navy airplane. But I've flown C-47. We had one of those also at Lewis. The Air Force office had that we could fly, and that was his primary aircraft at Langley NASA facility, and at Edwards Air Force Base, the C-47. And it was particularly reliable. I understand it's thousands probably still flying today that are of that vintage transport. Now, when I said what's different today, if you went to, I assume the F-22, even started with the F-16 with fly-by-wire, but most of those aircraft that you would say fly and have had great handling qualities, that's primarily provided by the expertise of the flight control designer, who through the software is overcoming what you might consider would have been bad characteristics to make it fly nice. And so it's really not just the primary aerodynamics of an aircraft that would make it nice to fly. It's that help through computers that does that augmentation to make it fly nice. So it's a different game today than it was back when you had cables and pulleys that ran to the control surfaces.
I'm Richard Knowles, and I have a question about all the satellites and the debris in space. It sounds like huge numbers of things up there. Is that a concern?
It is a concern. You know, space station several times now, based on the tracking by the Air Force at Colorado Springs, has slightly used the Russian propulsion system to change its orbit a bit because of what they've considered would be a near miss. A lot of that debris is caused by upper stages that had been left in orbit that still had propellant and oxidizer remaining. And over time, sitting in orbit, their seals have leaked and actually caused an explosion to create a lot of that debris from upper stages that were left. There's been talk of a cleanup at some point. That obviously has not had a mission yet that would affect that to any degree. The articles, though, to a certain size, are being tracked as well as for meteorites, asteroids as well, to check that on any given launch or any time on orbit they could be a hazard. Of course, they go down to probably a size small that are not being tracked.
Hey, Fred, I have another question for you that only an Apollo era astronaut can answer. And that is, what was the experience like trying to don and doff the A7L surface spacesuit?
Okay. Yeah, the A7L depended on the person. Kim Mattingly could easily do that himself. I was never that good. I've tried it a few times, but it really took the help of another person, particularly get the zipper done right. Otherwise, the suit was I could handle in every respect to get into it, which you had to do, particularly getting your head up through the ring when you got partially into it. But other than that, closing that final zipper and making sure that was fastened, that for me took another person to help in that donning operation. The suit itself, as we saw from the excursions that were made on 6 landings, did the job. It was obviously very tough. I was kind of nervous on some of the latter landings when the astronauts got pretty ambitious with their hopping around and pounding on sharp rocks and things like that. I was afraid they might eventually fall or hit hard against something that would cause a leak through the suit, but it held up through all that kind of rough activity that was done on the lunar surface over those 6 missions when they landed. So it was a rugged suit, and as far as I knew, it on all the missions performed as advertised to support those extravehicular excursions that people did. In the last 15, 16, and 17, they went out 3 times and were out quite extensively, 6-7 hours each time. Had a rowboat ride, so they got to cover a little more distance in those flights.
Hi, Fred. It's Ron Franco.
Hey,
How you been?
why aren't you flying today?
I'd rather listen to you today.
Okay.
Good to hear your voice and great to see you. This isn't a technical question, but more a personal question. Do you have one item from the space program that you consider most precious?
You talking about a spacecraft item?
Certainly a spacecraft item or any memento that you've collected over the
Okay.
years that's most meaningful to you.
Well, I have several. I have a checklist pages showing the modifications we did. One in particular I used with school children, elementary and even in the middle school somewhat. It's a page that was what we call the burn card, where you wrote in all the X, Y, and Z positions, locations, and orientation of spacecraft, the burn time, how long the burn was going to be, that kind of thing. It was made for the next rocket maneuver you might be doing with the LEM or command module. And it had a blank area at the bottom, almost half the page at the bottom available. As I mentioned before, we had no blank paper. So I used that segment of that checklist when Jim Lovell, right after we did the first burn that got us back on the way to the moon, to get around the moon. He asked me to take a look at consumables, and I looked at power and water for cooling, not for drinking as much. And I got a lot of hand scratching at the bottom of that page. And I obviously made a view graph and later a PowerPoint, used it on PowerPoints to show children how I manually did the calculations in the old grocery store arithmetic way, to convince them that it was good to know your basic arithmetic, not depend always on that calculator, because that's what I was doing at that time, to show whether we would make it at the time with the water supply we had and the battery power we had in the LEM. I didn't compute oxygen because we had lots of oxygen. We had just the basic LEM tanks, but we had 2 backpacks that were full up, and we had 2 emergency bottles on each of those in case you got a hole in the suit on the lunar surface to get back inside. And each of those emergency bottles at 6,000 psi oxygen were 1 day's supply roughly. So I didn't even compute oxygen. We had lots of that. But I have a few other things. I have the ball cap I'm looking at on the shelf here that I wore. They gave me to wear when I got off the helicopter to go on board the Iwo Jima aircraft carrier, sitting here on the shelf. Several things in a safety deposit box that are, again, but we didn't have too much of the spacecraft hardware left. Like I said, we didn't get much of that. I gave away armrests. In fact, if you went to the Cradle of Aviation Museum on Long Island, you'll find one of those armrests that I took out of the LEM on display. And I gave one of the overhead lights to Owen Morris. He was the project manager on the LEM. The lunar module, I gave him that mounted on a plaque, that kind of thing.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Fred. We've used up a lot of your time, and we don't want to impose on that too much. So we really, really, really appreciate you spending the time with us. Before your little presentation here, we had a presentation that included Emily, Lois, Logan, John Wisenhunt, Alyssa, a lot of the space hipsters, and every one of them said to tell you hello and how much we were going to enjoy our visit with you, and they were absolutely right. So thank you so much for spending time with us today.
I'm great, and I wish you well with the facility. I know as a not for profit, I'm still engaged in that for Infinity. That it's a struggle to cover the overhead and keep things running. And I wish you well, and let me know if I can help in any way.
Well, we certainly will. We appreciate the offer, and we hope to talk to you again.
All right. Take care, everybody. Survived another winter. All right.
Bye-bye, Fred.
Bye-bye.
How cool is that?